Welcome back. We have another iPhone 6 on the bench with what looks like a screen problem, but it is in fact not a screen problem. We've tried two different screens and there's no touch and a bunch of white lines. So we do see the no touch issue quite a bit with iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. Generally we don't see any visual defects, but they do happen. Generally they happen in a way where there's flickering gray bars that come down from the top, they flicker. Or there's bars like this, or different kinds of bars, gray bars, clusters of bars, and it's almost never a screen issue. So what's actually going on with this phone is the Touch IC, which is a little chip on the logic board that controls the interface between the CPU and the touch part of the screen, the digitizer. And what happens is that chip separates from the logic board over time. So with the iPhone 6, because it's such a flexible phone, generally what happens is it doesn't have to be bent to cause this issue, but it can have small flexes in the pocket over time. And when that flex happens over and over and over and over, the motherboard actually flexes as well because it's bolted to the frame. And so what that does is it causes intermittent connections underneath the chips that are soldered onto the board. And generally with the 6 and 6 Plus, we see the Touch IC, the touch controller, be affected first because it's in a spot where the bend on the motherboard can occur more rapidly. So I don't know why these lines appear with Touch IC problems. I'm not sure exactly how the Touch IC integrates with the LCD section, but we do know that these lines are caused by the Touch IC. So we're going to take the chip off, fix some of the pads underneath, and put the chip back on. Looks like this one has been repaired before. Okay, so here's our Touch IC right here. And there's actually nothing wrong with this Touch IC. The problem is the pads underneath and the balls underneath of the chip, the solder balls. So all we really need to do is remove this chip, reball it, put wires on the pads that fail, and put the chip back on, and problem solved. And the way I remove this chip is I actually lift the entire board up by the chip So that way, when the chip is ready to come off, it comes straight up because the board goes straight down. This way you don't risk knocking other components around the chip, and also you use minimal heat on the board because as soon as the solder is melted, the chip comes off immediately. And once again, I know you guys are going to ask, I'm using 360 degrees. But once again, it's going to depend on your nozzle and your soldering station. But you'll see this does happen nice and quick. Just like that. We don't want to lift the board up too much by the chip because we don't want the board to take a big fall while the components around the chip are at melting point, solder melting point, because they could bump around. Generally that's not an issue. You want to lift the board up enough to just get the chip off and clear of everything else. So I'm preheating this a bit since we're not using the bottom heater before I take the wick to the board, because it's good to have a little bit of heat in the board before we start wicking it, because we don't want the wick to solder itself to the pads and then we're pulling pads off the board. That's really bad. Once again, more work that's unnecessary. Want to avoid it. And once again, just sweeping the pads. We're putting pressure on the wick, not on the pads. Sweeping the pads, not scraping the pads. We want to go slowly so we give everything time to heat up. Okay, so we've removed the chip and we've cleaned the solder off of the pads, and now it's time to have a look at what actually causes touch disease on the 6 and 6 Plus. So the known point of failure is the M1 pad, which is this guy here, and also this guy here can also be suspect. So what happens is, over time, with repeated flexing of the phone, you get a very, very, very small break between the trace part and the pad part. You can't even see it under the microscope. So what we do is we scrape the traces, exposing the copper, and then we put solder or wire running across to bridge the gap. And oftentimes when you go to scrape these traces, you'll notice that the pad itself will fall right off the board because it's actually separated, but you can't really see it. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on how bad the damage is. So we're going to go ahead and scrape these a little bit and expose some of the copper. And you want to be careful when you're doing this, because if you scrape too hard, you can actually rip the trace right off of the board, and that's not a fun repair. This is a fun repair. Repairing traces themselves, not so much fun. So this one is not too bad. The pads didn't fall off. So we're just going to add solder to bridge the gap between the trace and the pad itself, which should be sufficient. We just want to let that cool for a little bit before we clean all that gunk off the chip. This is what happens when you re-ball chips on a dirty table. But as long as the dirt's on top of the chip and not on the bottom, we don't really mind. Alright, so our lines are gone and our touch is working. We just want to make sure that every sector of the screen is responding to touch. And it looks good. Especially in the keyboard region, if there's any sectors dead spots at all, the keyboard won't work properly.